Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for being here. The reason this exhibition is here is because of pure serendipity. Bonnie, you're going to deny that it has anything to do with you. You always do, but it wouldn't be here without Bonnie. After Joe's memorial, she very kindly asked me whether I would like to visit the studio one more time, which I did. It was a little strange to see it untouched without him, but it was also very comforting to see the work. There were some works on paper on the walls, and I said, you know, this would be a really good show for the studio school. And guess what? There were 50 works that Joe had selected for a works on paper retrospective that was supposed to be at the Cincinnati Art Museum and never happened because it turned out to be too much work. So here were these 50 works chosen by the artists with an introduction written by the artist, essentially ready to go. Well, that was the proverbial no-brainer. We don't have 50 of the works, but we have a selection of 30-odd from that 50. So what you're seeing is a retrospective of works on paper chosen by the artists. And I feel very lucky that we have it, and thank you, Bonnie.
My pleasure.
So everyone's had a different kind of relationship with Joe's work. I was introduced to him what feels like a very long time ago by Carl Beltz, who did a very important show at Brandeis many years ago. And Timothy, you did a wonderful show in Philadelphia.
In 2016. Mm-hmm. But I actually became aware of Joe's work and got to know him at least a little bit at that time in Cincinnati, where I began to work in 2000, so about 25 years ago. His family was from Cincinnati, and both he and his brother went to the Art Academy of Cincinnati, which was then affiliated with the Cincinnati Art Museum and the school together. So they grew up with the museum and its collection, and Joe, I think, remained fond of it. And so he and I got acquainted at that time, and we talked about things, but we never had an opportunity to acquire or present his work at the Cincinnati Art Museum before I left in 2006. So 2016 in the exhibition in Philadelphia was kind of the realization of a project that had been deferred for a decade.
It was a wonderful show, as I recall.
Well, that's all due to Joe. And
yes.
We can talk about a little bit about that later.
He was, if nothing else, intensely involved in his work. Harry, what's your connection?
Thank you, Karen, for assembling us. I probably have the slimmest connection. I have 2 points of connection, I think, and but they left a lasting impression on me. First of all, when I was a curator at Harvard, the Fogg Art Museum, a patron, a couple of patrons, Debbie and Martin Hale, wanted to donate a work by Joseph to us. And my colleague, Linda Norden, and I went to New York and visited the studio, had a wonderful visit, and we selected a painting, and I can't remember if we agreed, but I like yellow, so we got a yellow. No, we got a yellow painting, and then a red painting came from another couple, Irving and Natalie Foreman. These are both 1999 paintings, very deep, dark red painting, and we hung them and enjoyed them. And the red painting was given in honor of Michael Fried. And as you may know, Michael was a great fan and champion of Joseph's, are we
And a
saying
great
Joseph or
friend.
Marioni, or Joseph's work, and a great friend. And he would have been here, but he has trouble traveling now, so I'm your Michael Fried substitute.
No, Harry, you're not.
And
a
I did
substitute.
study with Michael at Hopkins, and I feel I can represent. No, I can't, but.
You are here entirely with your own charm and merits.
Okay, thank you. Now I just need to think, what would Michael have said? No. And then at the National Gallery recently, Michael helped with an acquisition of a marvelous big painting, Helios 2 from 2020, which was the gift of the artist in honor of Michael, which I was honored to shepherd into the gallery. I think I was also on a panel with him at the Phillips, a Rothko symposium, possibly. Does that make sense, Bonnie?
There was a panel when
Yeah.
Joe had work installed at the Phillips.
Yeah, okay.
Which Michael was on, and I was on, and
Well,
I think
I
you-
heard that anyway.
yeah.
I might have said something, I don't
Yeah.
know. So that's my story.
Yeah.
But it's, going to that visit to the studio was so memorable.
Yeah.
And if you've seen the film of Joseph, that's what he did for us. He showed us how he, distilled the paint and arranged the materials and stretched the canvases and gave us his whole method and with all of its justification about his analysis of light and pigment, and not your average studio visit.
he was extremely generous and had invited my second-year MFA2 students to the New York studio on several occasions, and it was that kind of analysis of color and his way of working. And I remember everyone was just floored by how immaculate the studio was. Now, the floor carpeted with rejected canvases, face down, and this absolutely passionate and lucid discussion of the nature of color. But Bonnie, you have a much longer connection than any of us.
I do, but what all of you say is correct, and he was exactly like that as a 20-year-old. A person with a singular focus and attention to detail, and quite honestly, nothing could have deterred him from his path forward. Everything else was just superfluous. And as I told Timothy a little while ago, when he was in graduate school, one of his professors said, well, bring something that represents blue to you, and he brought a blue piece of paper. Well, his professor wasn't very happy, but he thought it was just perfectly appropriate.
Well, one of the things that he clearly liked, and you can see it in the film clip that we have, was being told that he was making literal paintings, and by which I think he interpreted that as meaning that these were objects
Yes.
that were completely autonomous and not about anything. They just were. So he talked about the blue, he talked about them as being portraits of colors. And at one point, and he didn't seem to stick to this, but one of the visits with my students, he was talking about the character of each color requiring a different orientation of the painting. So that green and blue were landscape colors and had to be horizontal, and red and yellow were people. Now, he didn't stick to that, obviously, but at one point it was something he clearly thought about. Did he talk about that with you?
He talked about it all the time, and generally they were portraits, portraits of color in his terms. for him, you know, blue is the most accessible to people. They always tended to be small. He never sort of thought of blue as an expansive color in the way he would consider sky. He didn't think about it in that kind of sense. And lots of them were little verticals, very small, little portrait, little tiny portraits. And for him, green was the most difficult thing to paint because it was a kind of a landscape issue, and he didn't paint landscapes. He painted portraits, and his very last painting, which is named Barnett Newman, was, he felt, his real breakthrough into painting green, and it is horizontal, just like a landscape.
He named it Barnett
He
Newman.
did name it Barnett Newman.
I need to hear a little more about that.
There isn't very much to hear. I know that he did write an essay about it, but it was just completed shortly before his death. And nobody's seen it unless you've been in the studio in Pennsylvania.
Well, maybe it will turn up in an exhibition someday.
I would expect. But he had the most affinity for yellow in terms of, he painted more yellow paintings. They're not the easiest to sell. Blue ones are, followed by red ones. But if you would think of Rothko, for example, as being a red painter, he was a yellow painter. He didn't like yellow better than any other color. It's just that he had some particular affinity for it. But you can see in the drawings that the drawings don't have anything basically to do with it, and he wouldn't have called them drawings to begin with. He would only have called them works on paper, because
Some of them are called paintings.
they're
on
called
paper.
painted drawings, some of them. But
Yeah.
they're all about the pigment and all about the color, and just like the paintings, there is no object in them. They themselves are the whole object.
And one of the things that's very striking to me about the works on paper is how different they are from the paintings, because they're about the fact of doing something on paper.
They're about the material.
About the
They're about
material,
the material.
exactly. But you had a very interesting thought about the material, Timothy, about acrylic versus oil.
Well, it's a funny thing when you look at Joe's paintings and you think about the materials he used. And I've always been a bit perplexed by the fact that we associate transparency and glazes in painting with oil paint. And there's a long tradition of that, and a good reason for it, because oil lends itself to that kind of work, and it dries over a long period of time, and you can do very, very interesting things with layering very thin glazes of color. But Joe chose acrylic, which is I'm not a painter, so I really can't speak authoritatively about this, but I think it's a much more difficult thing to manage, to get those transparencies and to get something that, at least in my mind, would approximate a glaze, and then to get a range of different surfaces or finishes on the surface. Some of them are very, very glossy. Some are not. Some are almost matte. And how we manage to do that with acrylic is, and probably will always remain, a bit of a mystery to me.
Well, it's less of a mystery if you know about Golden's paint, because I see the painters in the audience are all grinning. They've made their mission in life to make acrylic do anything. And there are additives and mediums and things that allowed Joe to do what he did.
Except he didn't paint with golden paint.
He didn't paint
He
with
did
golden
not
paint.
paint with
That's
golden
interesting.
paint. Not.
So much for that theory.
This was once upon a time. There was once upon a time Liquitex, and he painted with Liquitex, and the pigment.
Which was very unforgiving.
And then at some point in time along came Guerra. And after Guerra came along, there was no anything else.
Okay.
I think that the difference a lot between what he talks about as matte as versus gloss is related to the opacity of the pigment that's in that layer of paint. Some pigments are very transparent and lend themselves to very transparent glazes, and others don't. And so the difference in the paintings is the more matte ones are very surface, and you can't get inside the painting very easily. Whereas the gloss ones show you the depth and a little bit of peekaboo of what's behind it. But that's related to the paint, and that paint comes in various viscosities. Some of it's thinner and runs more, and others doesn't, and that's the only basic explanation. He did, of course, decide whether he wanted the paint to slip or the paint to really sit on the surface. So if you want it to sit on the surface, the previous coat has to be dry. And if you want it to slide slightly, it has to be just a little bit damp. Set, but not quite hard. And that would be the difference in what they look like and what he achieved in the different kinds of paintings.
He talked about finding the light and having the light come out of the painting. He did at one point, that it wasn't, those layers were somehow still translucent enough that there'd be some kind of internal light, you know.
I think one thing we should add for people who may not know his painting as well as you folks is that we were talking about, red painting, a yellow painting, but no painting is just made of one color.
No.
There are these layers, and it's not a layer of a lot of different yellows. It's a layer of yellow on top of green on top of brown or what have you.
And
right.
the edges are sometimes revealed. The
Yes,
edge of a flow of paint will somehow be pushed back in some way.
right, but the final effect is of a single color for the most part on the surface, and unless you look very, very closely, right?
In fairness, when they lose that internal light, for him, they had failed.
Those are the ones that were on the floor.
They're on the floor, absolutely on the floor. And he was fairly merciless and would go back decades later and say, well, this is unsatisfying. And he'd come home at the number of the painting and give me just a little strip of canvas, and I would know that he had destroyed it because it just didn't speak to him anymore. It wasn't as though everything that he produced was a masterpiece. That wasn't, and very few of them were in his mind, because there was always somewhere to move and somewhere to go forward and something else that he wanted to see what would happen.
And it was always a question of whether what worked in the studio could be reproduced. The experience could be reproduced in another space. I mean, so much of it depended on natural light.
Well, the difference between him and Robert Ryman, whom he knew, is that Robert Ryman painted only in artificial light. And he really did not like the fact that the change of light changed his paintings over time, which is why he did that. And that was one of the things that Joe actually did appreciate. And he would leave it on the wall in the studio and sit there during the day and watch the light change. Because among other things, this painting is going in a museum or it's going in someone's home, and you don't know what the environment is going to be or what the light's going to be like. And so it had to work in his terms, since he was the only arbiter of correctness, no matter what the circumstance was going to be.
But he always preferred natural light. I mean, he used to talk about how paintings that are seen in natural light were moving pictures, because
Yes.
as the angle of the blueness or the redness of the light changed during the day, it would change the painting. He'd probably hate this installation because it's all artificial light and probably a little too much light.
I think you might be wrong, because the works on paper and the paintings are really, really different.
That's
And he
reassuring.
actually made all of them in a place in the house where there was no natural light.
That's very reassuring.
So when he when he came to talk to me in Philadelphia and proposed an exhibition, one of the things that I realized is that although Joe described himself as painter, Joseph Marioni painter, he could have in certain circumstances, certainly in my experience, described himself as Joe Marioni curator as well, because he came fully equipped to answer every question that he posed. In other words, it was a great setup for me to take what he was offering, and I was happy to do it, but he really had thought it through entirely, and that included not only the gallery he wanted the work to be shown in, but also the checklist of paintings. He wanted to put in a sculpture from our collection, a 7th century Khmer image of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddhist deity of compassion, but he also wanted a gallery that had natural light. And so that the works, as Karen said, could be experienced in different types of light, day in, day out. As having lived with the show then for 4 or 5 months, I came to realize how very important it was for an appreciation of what he meant when he said I want the paintings to embody light and embody colored light. And in point of fact, they did, even the darkest ones, which I thought was the most magical thing. And we ended up acquiring a very big and 12 by 8 and very dark painting from that selection for the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
The dark paintings are magical. I mean, they're really eye-testing. You have to spend time with them, and then they come alive. Is the painting you just acquired dark painting? Was it?
No.
That's a yellow?
Yes, of course.
Helios has to be yellow, right?
Yes, Helios too.
Oh, of course.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we had it on view. We have it on view now, actually.
Now that you're open.
Now that we're back open, it is still on view, and in its own space, its own wall in the atrium. Not in a lot of natural light, because natural light in that atrium is too strong often, and has shafts of light, and but there is a sense of ambient light there, and it's a great thing to have, and to have on its own. I mean, I think hanging his work next to other work, I don't know about that. I don't know how that works. I can't actually imagine that too well, because I don't think of other painters who are painting like this.
No.
The color field painters are they're soaking the paint into the canvas. I mean, as Timothy was saying, you were talking about glazes and how that's more connected to oil paint. It's also, I think, very connected to old master painting, and not so much connected to contemporary painting in general. So it's a challenge.
It's interesting you're saying that, because the Phillips show was supposed to be a conversation between Marioni's work and works in the Phillips collection. I remember his telling me how frustrating it was that everything he picked, the curator would say, no, we can't move that. So he didn't end up with the ones that he particularly wanted. But they weren't interspersed with his work. They were in a separate space. It wouldn't have worked in that way.
They tend to be very quiet and contemplative, and look at color field painting. It's rather noisy in a lot of ways, much more active, less meditative, I think.
Maybe we should talk about the drawings too,
Yes.
because
Okay.
we've been talking
Yes.
about the paintings.
Yeah. So, Timothy and Harry, did you know the works on paper before?
Just from a couple of catalogs where, they get occasionally included or reproduced, but no, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily have thought it was the same artist, except for clearly some of the monochrome. I'm actually think of them as monopolychromes or polymonochromes, but the ones that look like they're made of one color certainly relate closely to the paintings, but these works, I mean, how different can you get? These are discontinuous, matte, colored notations that couldn't be more different from the painting. So I'm very curious to hear about, think about, you know, how this is the same artist.
Well, I mean, there are lots of similarities with the paintings, starting with the fact that there are colored grounds he's working on, and the surface layer of the drawing reveals that in certain ways with lines in the grid, but
Yes,
also with a
grid
border,
lines.
and also I think the most interesting, successful of the drawings, at least those that use grids, are the ones where he's really worked the surface, and you can see
There's one.
each
Yeah, one
of the
right there.
squares is actually textured in a different way, and so it's a very beautiful example of a kind of transparency, very different than painted transparencies that he was after,
Yes.
but translated into a different medium, and you know, I think he was really quite. My first impression of the drawings was how skillful he was in using pastels, right? And secondly, that boy, these took a lot of work. He was clearly he was deliberate in the way he put these together, and he put in the time and the effort, and they show it beautifully. They're really interesting in that regard.
Yeah. And as we can see here, the transparency is a matter of sort of intermittency, right? That the pastel, this is that it's sitting up on the tooth of the paper, and the black ground is coming through, and so managing to get an effective transparency in a totally different medium with different demands. I liked the fact that he also talked about. I read that he liked how the paper absorbed the oil of the oil from the pastel, leaving almost pure pigment sitting on those grounds. So a totally different way of getting that purity of pigment that he wanted in the painting.
So when I first started looking at the drawings in reproduction, I went through the various writings on Joe and various things that he said, and found a few comments on his drawings which I've really found quite interesting. One is that he noted that drawing had become a kind of autonomous artistic activity in the second half of the 20th century, by which I think he meant no longer was married in some way, shape, or form to painting as a preparatory drawing or sketch or what have you, but it had its own logic and its own kind of independence. And when he talked about these drawings, he said a few things that I think are really interesting. The pastel he used in the drawings, he called it a marking substance, which is a very interesting thing and not something that I would associate with a painting, because he made paintings in an entirely different way. But I think he did make marks with the pastel, and he disciplined them primarily with the grid in those drawings. And secondly, he said, and I think he went on to contradict himself a little bit later, but he said, and I quote here, "Color is still important in the drawings, but less so than," here again I quote, "the specific performance of the gesture." And I think it's always well to remember that he grew up at a time when gestural painting was kind of everywhere and dominant, and certainly I think he probably, and you know better than I, he probably went through a phase, or maybe several, where he painted gesturally in undergraduate or graduate school.
Not really.
Not really.
Not really, and the thing that he wanted to do with his paintings is for you not to see his hand and not to see the gesture.
Yeah. But you can't help but see it
In the
in
drawings,
the
you can't
drawings.
avoid it, but in the paintings, he wanted his hand out of it. And I think he was relatively successful, although we did talk about the fact that the paint always flows from the top right to the bottom left, because using a roller, if you're right-handed, you paint in that direction.
And that's another interesting distinction with the drawings, particularly those that use the grid, is that it's evenly dispersed. It's non-directional. It's very different in character in that regard than what he's doing with the paintings.
And it was very purposeful and very specific. Most of those grids are drawn with a silver pencil of one sort or another. But he had a whole worksheet of different colors and different brands of silver pencil, and depending upon what kind of work he was going to make, the grid was made with a different silver behind it. And even if you don't see the grid, they're all hung on a grid.
Yeah, they are. But the whole character of the works on paper is so specific to the medium and to the scale and the act of putting stuff on, in exactly the same way that the paintings are about what Michael would call the paintness of paint. So it's very consistent despite all the differences.
He actually used the phrase truth to materials, which isn't the most popular phrase maybe these days, but it shows him coming out of such a classic deep modernist idea, inherited, I guess, most recently from Greenberg and Fried, that,
Joe had a very strong disagreement with Greenberg.
Okay. I was thinking, I'm the only person who hasn't been corrected up here yet.
It's not a correction, it's a footnote. And this has always stayed with me. And my students have heard it a million times, so they can tune out now. Greenberg said that the irreducible quality, a characteristic of painting, was flatness. And Joe disagreed with that. He said the irreducible characteristic of painting was color.
Yes, and light. Okay, so I'll just come back by saying that they did agree that painting has some irreducible characteristic.
Definitely.
The only question is, what is it? Right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well done.
One thing I wanted to hear about from all of you, but maybe Bonnie in particular, is the musical aspect of these drawings, because we were saying there's no reference, they're autonomous, but there's references to music that you were talking about.
There are references to his life. So when he was a young man, he was trained as a pianist. He was a very fine pianist, and he played harpsichord and sang in the opera as a basso, as an extra. And he was in the glee club in high school, and music was very important to him. And he liked rather offbeat music. Cincinnati was famous for a group called the La Salle Quartet, and the La Salle Quartet performed mostly atonal music. And this is not most people's cup of tea. So he has whole sets of drawings that are called atonal etudes. And they owe a great deal to music, but if you look at one of the works here that's called Nocturne, it's about that peacefulness and restfulness of night, and it hangs next to something called a fugue, which is an indifferent kind of form of music, and it looks entirely different. So that he understood what he was doing when he was doing this. And one of them has a musical notation about a correction. He wanted to move one square from one place to another, and he wrote, move a particular thing up one step from C to D as opposed to C to C sharp. And a friend of mine pointed out to me recently that what he was doing with color and music are the same. It's the feeling you derive from various kinds of wavelengths of things and how you feel when you take it in. All of us are going to respond differently, but they are about a similar sort of effect on the human person.
I found the harpsichord reference very interesting because these paperworks with references to music are staccato in the way that harpsichord notes are. They don't sustain.
Discrete, yeah. Pure, discrete,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
He loved music and listened to it all of the time. He stopped playing the piano in New York because the circumstances of where he lived is the heat was space heat like you have in a place like this, too dry to keep the piano. It could never stay in tune and ultimately might have cracked the sounding board. And so after he moved and began to totally devote himself to painting, didn't play anymore. And he gave away his mother's piano to the University of Washington.
Well, it found other ways, I guess.
I guess.
Well, we have time for questions. If maybe we get the lights on.
I would just like to ask each of you, how would you situate Marioni in recent art history? You mentioned Robert Ryman and color field. How do each of you feel his position is, and how did he himself situate himself with his peers?
Who wants to do this?
I've got something to throw out here, which may get shot down, but I was thinking, I hope it will, I was thinking of James Turrell as an artist who is equally focused on the experience of light, even though it is not colored light on canvas, and it's not the idea of facing a sort of substitute portrait on a wall, but because I couldn't really think of painters that I mean, that was for me an artist that has a similarity across mediums.
I find that a very interesting and convincing comparison.
Okay.
I would say because
I'm going to leave now.
Yeah, I mean, of course, because Joe's using paint, he has such a bigger range.
And to be able to do that with paint,
Yeah,
arguably a little easier to do it with the heavens and the light itself, but to do it with the pigment, as Joseph said, dividing the light, is...
of course, the most remarkable Turrell I ever saw was a sky space in Florida, which...
well, I'm thinking of the sky spaces
Yeah.
in general.
Yeah,
for sure.
rather than the projected light.
Yeah. But maybe there's some other...
I mean, he would have described himself as being part of a very small movement of a very small group of painters in the late 1970s called radical painting, in which the idea that there was no information to be had other than exactly how big it was, what the materials were, and what color you perceived, and it was an object about nothing other than its own self. And there were not a lot of them then, and there are not a lot of them even still living. But if you're interested, that would be what you would look for. And there's a fair amount of information out on the web that you'll be able to find about that.
I think you have to be interested, if you're going to be interested in Joe's work or find it interesting, you have to be interested in the history of abstraction. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Not everyone is, but abstraction is, all things considered, still a relatively new phenomenon, little more than 100 years old. And I think there's, the last several decades have been very interesting in terms of different artists sort of finding their way forward out of the situation in the 1960s, in particular, of minimalism. Which kind of theoretically was said to have killed or inhibited or kind of forestalled the development of painting thereafter. And there was a lot of ink spilled on this subject for the longest time, particularly in the 1970s. And that's, that's not the moment where he embraced this. He did so before, but Joe was really kind of swimming upstream for a long time in terms of the perception of the sense of possibilities in painting, its potential for more, particularly abstract painting. And I think if I understood Michael Fried's essay on the Brandeis show in the late 90s, Joe did find a way forward and a new sense of possibility in something truly minimal. And he what's so impressive, he remained consistently focused on something that was ultimately, by his own admission, truly reductive and very simple, but also admitted of almost infinite variation in terms of the effects that could be produced. And I remain really kind of very much persuaded and impressed by his justification for the choices he made and how they are embodied in his paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Timothy, there's abstraction and there's abstraction, right? It's a vast, complicated language, and the way that Marioni approached it was with incredible dedication, obsession, and focus, almost the equivalent of like a papal hair shirt. I mean, it was it's a certain kind of reductive abstraction. So Harry, you mentioned, and maybe it's kind of worth opening up the portal to looking at people who would appreciate the work, who bought the work. So you talked about Foreman, and Panza was also. So collectors who gravitated to this kind of austere abstraction, and I'm glad you called it polychromatic as well, because it's not. It's rich, it's fluid, and it's rich, and it's spectral. It's not mono, it's poly. But the collectors, a very specific breed. So I have always been interested that the Europeans tended to gravitate to this kind of work more than the Americans. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Why do we think that's true? I'm curious.
I can tell you some of the things that Joe would have said about it himself. That the Europeans have a long tradition of collecting, which doesn't really exist in this country. People lived with paintings in their homes. This was always the case. And his work came out of much more of a European tradition. He thought about Renaissance paintings when he was a boy, and the beautiful color, and all of the things that went along with it. And I don't think that he thought of himself as coming out of any kind of American painting tradition at all. Nor did he think about himself as an abstract painter, because he would have said to you, an abstraction of what? It's not an abstraction of something, it was for him, just whatever it is, that's what it is.
And I would say also, because I experienced the same thing, I used to watch what the German and Swiss museums were doing, because they embraced a lot of things that were happening here long before their American counterparts did. I think it has to do, to some extent, with the history of abstraction, its development, its locus over time, much of which was really in Europe. But also, and we need some time to kind of unpack this, but I do think that there's more of an embrace there of philosophical painting that is very much grounded in a philosophical approach to the work and indeed life. And Joe exemplified that in so many ways. Mm-hmm.
It's a cultural difference. So difference between New York City and a Zen Buddhist temple, where the work that we're talking about has a mantra that's about quietude, yeah, as much as it is about kind of spectral color and light.
Thank you.
So I think that in the last couple of minutes, there's been a response to my question, which is adequate in itself, but I still like to pose the question in a more direct way, and that is, can any of you, or how do you account for the, what I would call the extreme resistance to Joseph Marioni's painting in the American context? As I say, this bringing up the relationship with Europe, bringing up perhaps a different cultural tradition of collecting, bringing up the notion of a philosophical dimension is all part of it. But it still needs to be said, it seems to me, that there was a very explicit, and I would even say violent, resistance to Marioni's work here in the American context. And I think it requires more explanation.
I'll give you my 2 cents. This is a picture culture. Images, Courier and Ives, prints of that kind, Saturday Evening Post, and that's what most of the country understands. And he wasn't painting pictures. And relatively close to his death, I said to him one day, I finally understand why people can't see your paintings. They're looking for something, because they're accustomed to seeing something. There's no cow, no house, no train, no nothing to see. It's just whatever your experience is. And particularly in culture now, when culture is often movies, videos, things like that, quick moving, nothing that takes a lot of time. It requires you to slow down and to just look. And I think it's just not an American sensibility particularly.
Well, to reinforce that, you're making me think about an exhibition I worked on that traveled in Europe of Stuart Davis. And everywhere it was shown, it was in Venice, it was in Amsterdam, I think it went to Rome. And people were enormously excited about it because it fulfilled their expectations of Americanness. Because of the intensity, the color, and the clarity, the drawing, and the image, even the ones that were not specifically recognizable images, there was a character that they felt embodied American work, which is very, very different than Joe's work.
I would add a generational component, because certainly we know that Rothko, Newman, Ryman had a great deal of success, but those are 1 or 2 generations, if not more, older. And I think Marioni was someone who felt that there was more to do with, more to do with that tradition, that it still could be extended, and at a time when, the pictures generation and other things were happening, as Bonnie said. And so a little time out of joint aspect, I think, too.
And he would have
his
said
work.
that. He would have said, I came along a little bit too late.
And I think that's an important point, and maybe speaks to your question in a slightly different way, Paul. That is to say, there was a tremendous resistance to where American, I'm going to say abstract again, it's more complicated than that, I agree. American non-objective art, minimalism, and what have you, ended up in the late 60s, and particular concern of all sorts about the role of painting in that, and the role of and the potential of painting going forward. And Joe emerges at that very moment as a kind of odd and an almost resistant strain to a lot of what unfolded in American painting, particularly in terms of figuration and representation in the 70s and 80s, and continued to insist. This was the choices he had made and the direction in which he was pushing his work was vital and absolutely important, both materially and philosophically, for the future of painting. It must have been a very lonely place to be for so much of that time. I think now, with the benefit of a lot of hindsight and the production of a whole career in which he proved the point over and over again, I think we have a different perspective on it, and maybe more acceptance at the end of the day too.
And the bottom line is difficult painting. You really have to pay attention. You have to stop, and you have to look, and you have to put in the time. And has been said, this is a culture of the quick fix.
And maybe that's where the works on paper come in, because if you're not totally comfortable looking at a monopolychrome a slab of divided light in front of you, rectangular more or less, you know, the drawings have, there's aspects of rhythm certainly, and you know, polyrhythm, if you will, and you know, composition. And I think it's a great way in, you know,
They're more
to
accessible.
his work.
They're much more accessible,
And to have this
They
show
are.
where you're mixing, and I mean, his selection mixing the works on paper that look like the paintings with ones that are more analytical and divided in a different way, I think is you know, a good thing.
And I think that also, pastel is such a seductive
Yeah.
medium.
I mean, look at that. Look at that one.
Yeah.
That gorgeous.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's an early one, too.
That striation and layering. I mean, think of Degas. Think of Italian Futurism. I mean, it's just. And apparently, he did two of those, and that was it.
It's hard for me to know how many
Yeah.
there really were, because what still exists and what there once was, I do know that there is another big one,
Yeah.
like one more big one like that.
Well,
So,
if-
so when
if
I
the-
first saw these, I was taken by how seductive they are, and a little surprised too, because again, just initially I thought that perhaps Joe would have resisted that kind of seduction, but I think he found that in color and materials, and his paintings are equally seductive, I think, in very interesting ways.
Well, I'm hoping that if this does act, and not to interrupt the questions, we have time for a couple more, but if the works on paper act as a way in, you just have to go uptown to 57th Street, and there are paintings on view at Yarra's Gallery,
And works on paper.
and works on paper.
For one more.
Let's do two more. Those hands have been.
Let's do two more. We have two hands up.
You know, this is the first time I'm really acquainted with his work, but what I noticed is that a lot of the pieces were made in color A paper. And that's, you know, material that's American, out of that time, that provides you with tremendous ideas about color and what to do with it. And he seemed to have played to that, and I wonder what you can say to this.
There are only 4 pieces that are on color aid paper. And yeah, they look like it because they're all on colored paper of some kind, but the ones that are literally on color aid are all together on a wall, and they are not made with oil pastels. Those drawings are made with just colored pencil, and they just have very, very thin lines of color, very low contrast, very hard to see them. The specifics of them, some of them I can tell you because I have written down how many lines precisely there are on the page. And they belong to a set of things that is about a musical performance. I can't tell you what the performance was intended to be, but they are described as an opus and a performance number, and some of them are called prelude, and they are all about music, and they are a series. Those don't belong to a series, in which the lines move from one place to another, like you're playing music.
Thank you very much for so many insightful observations. I'm curious, however, about a couple of things. First, and I recently saw the Yara show, first, I really appreciated the reference to early Italian painting, because light begins in art, more or less, with early Italian painting. And if, in fact, he is going to be engaged in light in the various ways you've described, you can't brush that aside, and I suspect, I'd love you to speak a little bit more about that. But it seems to me that that opens the issue about transcendence and about the relationship of making to your making, and to the way in which he perceived the larger powers of the world. Obviously, in early Italian Renaissance, it's mostly spiritual. And if there's a transcendent spiritual element in his work, I'd love to hear about that. Because it seems to me that there's a kind of counter to that, and that is a repression of that, because that is too mystical, it's too redone, it's in some ways too old-fashioned too. So there's a kind of tension in the work between embracing that, because you have to, because it exists already, and resisting it. That's vis-a-vis the early Italian spiritual side. But conversely, finally, light is essential to Impressionism. And it is obviously something which we don't see or feel or recognize in his work, but there had to have been some relationship, I imagine even more resistance to the physicality of Impressionism and to its momentary quality, its temporal quality, which he wanted to be able to, if you will, supersede. So if you could...
I'll do it fast. He felt that religion was anti-intellectual. So there was no spiritual quality of the kind you're talking about. His first experience with art, and if you watch the film, you'll see he talks about being in his father's library when he was a little boy, and the biggest books were the Renaissance picture books that he would take off the shelf and look at. And so those were his first experiences with art. I can't tell you painting because he would have objected to saying anything about it because they were only reproductions, and he had a real attitude about the fact that there is a sensation to painting, and all you get from a reproduction is the information, and you lose all the rest of it. And he talks in that film about color being the children of the sun, and that if you are looking for God, you cannot see God because you cannot look into the sun. You can only see its children. So they're not mystical, they're not spiritual. He intends them to be exactly what you perceive and absolutely nothing more.
And I think he recognized that that was a way to go beyond that point in a sense. And he talks about that as a kind of paradox. He often described himself as a materialist, and I had a hard time figuring out what that was, but it was really about this insistence on understanding the nature of the materials he was using and how they interact and what can be produced through the mastery of those materials. And the stripping away of every function of painting except what he thought was fundamental, essential. And at one point he says, and I think this really gets to this issue, when we have achieved the full realization of an actualized painting, when we have stripped away all the worldly decor of the day and come to look upon the unadorned flesh of the body, just paint on canvas, what we see emanating from its body is dematerialized light. The material reveals the immaterial, and the great paradox of our modernity is our expectation that it should be something other than what it is. I really do think he felt that was a way through to something that was transcendent, something that was exalted in a sense. So.
And he was very specific in titling his paintings. Yes, he would call it red or blue or red painting or blue painting, but along with it had to go the idea that it was acrylic on linen on stretcher, because to him, the materials that he was using were as critical to your idea of what you saw, because what you saw was what it was. Nothing else. Just the experience of the materials, however big it was, whatever color it was, and that was it. There was nothing else.
But it was a way through to something else, and it required the participation of the viewer to be completed in a sense.
We have time for one more. I think, Jill, you had a question?
mean, I'm still curious about his response to other painters. Clearly, he had great esteem for Barnett Newman, if he titled his last painting Barnett Newman. And I'm just wondering if he was critical of Rothko, or if he was, he spoke about Rothko, I guess. Could anybody talk a little bit more about that?
He wasn't. I mean, he tended not to be particularly critical of anybody and anything that they were doing. I was telling Timothy the first time I went to the museum with him, he would never say he didn't like something. He'd say, oh, that's a very large painting, or that's a really nice frame,
Were there other painters, American painters, who were important to him?
Yes, Clifford Still was extremely important to him. A little bit of a crazy man, whom he knew, as a matter of fact. Yes, he liked Rothko. He liked Ryman. He liked Newman. People Agnes Martin, for example. Yeah, Agnes. He didn't dislike Mondrian in that sense. I mean, what he was doing was not like what Mondrian was doing, so it didn't relate. And he really liked art. So that it wasn't that he would say something terrible about Gauguin or say something terrible about Van Gogh or anybody else in particular. He liked art.
I remember running into him at the Valentin de Boulogne show, the follower of Caravaggio, and he was having a wonderful time looking at those paintings. Yeah.
He loved Turner, and he loved Titian, and all kinds of other people. He just loved painting. Vermeer would have been one of his absolute favorites, because he would have always talked about where the light came from in a Vermeer. That was very, very important to him. Certain Rembrandts, not all of them. And a lot of what happened to Rembrandt is, they were restored badly and people removed glazes that should have stayed on them. And he would talk about that, having worked with a conservator when he was a very young man. And so there were all kinds of issues about philosophy and material and things that went on in the world that interested him, in addition to just, music and painting. But the focus of his life was painting.
What a place to end. Thank you guys so much.